The night had swallowed the world whole, deep, endless, and suffocating. A blackened highway stretched endlessly beneath the wheels of a battered sedan, headlights barely cutting through the storm. Inside, a teenage girl sat still, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the seat, staring at the rain smeared across the windshield. Her heart pounded, though not with fear, but with the suffocating weight of a truth she wasn't yet ready to face. Maya. Her name echoed in her thoughts, but it wasn't just her name. It was the name that now belonged to a body lying still in the wreckage, someone she had never expected to lose: her parents. The accident had come like a whisper in the night, no warnings, no foreshadowing. One minute they were laughing, talking about a vacation in Europe, and the next the world had collapsed into glass and metal. The rain that night had blurred the lines of the road, making it seem like a dark tunnel, but Maya's mind had already known the truth long before the impact. They hadn't died by chance. Not by any means. When the car had spun out of control, Maya hadn't screamed. The silence had been deafening, as though the world had held its breath, just for a moment. The second the vehicle had hit the tree, her body had jerked against the seatbelt, and her world had gone black. The next thing she knew, the hospital lights had been too bright, too sterile. The beeping of machines had been the only thing that anchored her to reality. And the baby in her arms, the baby she could barely believe was hers, had been the only thing that had kept her tethered to this world, to any world at all. Her parents were gone, and everything they had built, everything they'd worked for, was slipping out of her grasp. The baby, her little brother, still so small and fragile, was the last piece of her life that hadn't been torn apart. The door to her hospital room creaked open. Maya didn't look up, not at first. It was a man's voice she heard, though she didn't recognize it immediately. "How's she doing?" The voice was gentle, but strained. A woman spoke next, and Maya turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting those of a nurse who had been in and out of her room since she'd woken up. "She's awake, but she needs rest. The trauma. And the baby. It's a lot to handle. Maybe some time alone will help." Maya didn't care. Rest wasn't an option. Not after what she'd seen in her parents' office, not after what she knew was true. A fleeting thought flashed through her mind. What if it was a mistake? But she knew better. This was no mistake. She hadn't been dreaming when she'd stumbled across her father's journal a few weeks before the accident. She hadn't imagined the pages filled with cryptic notes, strange references to a business partner who had never been introduced to her. Maya had seen the way her father's eyes would darken when that name came up in conversation, how his voice would lower in caution whenever he spoke of it. The night before the crash, she had asked her father about it, but he'd brushed her off. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just business." But Maya had known better. She had pressed him, and he had responded only with a warning to stay out of things that didn't concern her. But now she had no choice but to find out everything. "You're not alone, Maya," the nurse said, her voice breaking through Maya's reverie. "Your friend's been asking to see you. He's waiting outside." Maya blinked, the name of her friend suddenly surfacing in her mind. Eric. She hadn't seen him since the accident, hadn't heard from him either. He was the only one who'd stuck by her when her parents were still around. They'd been inseparable in school, their bond deeper than mere friendship. Without waiting for permission, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. The baby squirmed in her arms, tiny fingers clutching at her hospital gown. She held him close, feeling the warmth of his small body against her skin. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. As she walked out into the sterile hallway, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the walls, she felt her resolve harden. No more questions, no more doubts. She would get to the bottom of this. Eric was waiting in the lobby, his face pale with worry, his eyes searching for her. When he saw her, his expression softened, but there was something in his gaze, something more than concern, something that spoke to a bond deeper than friendship. Maya sat down beside him, glancing at the baby in her arms. The weight of the little life was a burden she didn't know how to carry, but she would learn. For him, for her parents, for the truth. "You ready?" Eric's voice was low, his eyes darting to the baby. "You know who did this?" Maya nodded, her heart beating louder now, each thud an echo of the vengeance growing inside her. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm going to make them pay." The world outside the hospital windows seemed too bright, too full of life. It mocked Maya, who felt like a ghost walking through it. Her parents, once towering figures in her life, now lay in the cold, silent graves outside. The only thing tethering her to the world of the living was the fragile bundle in her arms, the baby who was, in some strange way, both a piece of her past and her future. Eric had always been her closest friend, but now, as they sat side by side in the dark corners of her apartment, there was something different in the air, something heavier. The baby slept in a crib across the room, tucked under a faded blanket that Maya had picked out when she was still a child herself. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the city, the noise of life that felt so distant to her. "Where do we start?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her with an intensity that had always been there, but now felt more serious, more focused. Maya didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the worn pages of her father's journal, the one she'd found hidden in the back of his closet the day before the accident. He had been careful, too careful. That night, when she'd asked him about the business partner, Langston Blake, his eyes had flickered, something Maya couldn't quite place. Fear maybe, caution. But fear was a foreign emotion for her father. It unsettled her even now. "Langston Blake," Maya muttered, her voice thick with disgust as she repeated the name for the first time aloud. "I didn't think it was him at first, but now." Eric nodded. "You think he's the one behind it?" "I know he is." Maya's words were sharp, filled with certainty. The journal had left no room for doubt. Everything points to him. The journal's cryptic entries had been a puzzle. Business dealings, mentions of a new project, an expansion that had never made it to the boardroom. But the most chilling part was the last page, where her father had scribbled almost desperately, *Watch Langston. He's too ambitious, too hungry for control. If anything happens to me, look there. Do you think he? Eric hesitated, his eyes darting to the crib where the baby lay, peaceful and unaware of the dark storm gathering around them. "Do you think he ordered the crash?" Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the city below. The lights of downtown flickered like 1,000 tiny stars, oblivious to the devastation that had occurred only days ago. But Maya knew, deep in her bones, that the crash had been no accident. Langston Blake had wanted her family's business. He had wanted control. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment, the right leverage. And now he had it. "You have to be sure," Eric said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "You have to be careful. If Langston knows you're looking into this, he won't hesitate to do worse." "I know," Maya replied, turning to face him. "I know, but I can't just sit here and do nothing. I have to know the truth." Eric didn't argue. He understood. They had grown up together, shared everything, the dreams, the fears, the secrets. And Maya knew she wasn't the only one who had been affected by what had happened. Langston had stolen not just her parents' lives, but Eric's future as well. Their families had been business partners, allies for years. When her father's company had begun to grow, so had Eric's family's wealth and influence. Everything had been intertwined. But that was before the lies, before the betrayal, before Langston. "You know where to start," Eric said, his voice taking on a more determined edge. "You can't do this alone. We'll go through everything, the accounts, the contracts. If there's a paper trail, we'll find it." Maya looked at him, eyes narrowing with purpose. "I need you, Eric. But we can't just go in blind. I have to make sure he doesn't know we're coming." Eric's face hardened. "Then we'll have to be smart. We'll take our time. We'll plan it." The next few days passed in a blur of research, phone calls, and late-night strategy sessions. Eric had pulled all his resources, connections from school, his parents' old friends in the business world, anyone who might know something about Langston Blake. Meanwhile, Maya sifted through the endless piles of paperwork her parents had left behind, looking for something that might tell her what Langston had been up to before the crash. It wasn't long before they found something, a small, overlooked detail in her father's financial records. A series of transfers, payments made to a company that didn't exist on paper. It was buried in the fine print, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Maya had traced the payments to an offshore account, a name she hadn't expected to see: Langston Enterprises. It was a ghost company, one that appeared out of nowhere right around the time the expansion deal had gone sour. "Langston's been building something," Maya said one night, her voice trembling with anger as she stared at the glowing screen. "He was positioning himself to take over. If my father didn't comply with whatever deal Langston wanted, he'd be gone," Eric finished for her. "That's what happened. He pushed your parents out of the way, just like he planned." "But why the crash? Why not just take the company? Why kill them?" Maya asked, the question gnawing at her. Eric was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Langston Blake doesn't just want the company, Maya. He wants your family's name. He wants everything. And he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process." Maya's hand clenched around the edge of the desk, the papers in front of her now a blur. "Then that's exactly what he's going to get. I'm going to take everything back. Everything he stole from us. I'm going to make him pay for what he did." Eric looked at her, his expression conflicted, but there was no stopping her now. She had already made up her mind. It was time for the world to learn what Maya had learned, that she was no longer the helpless, grieving daughter of two brilliant entrepreneurs. She was now the one in control, the one who would make sure Langston Blake paid for his treachery, and she wouldn't stop until she had her revenge. The nights had grown colder in the weeks following Maya's discovery, as the storm inside her continued to build. Her grief had been replaced by a sharp, cold resolve. She had nothing left to lose. Not her parents, not the business, and certainly not the life she had once known. It was all a hollow memory now, filled with rage and the hunger for justice. Maya stood in front of the full-length mirror in the dimly lit office of her parents' old penthouse. The same penthouse she had once been proud to call home, now a fortress of determination. The room had been untouched since the funeral, with everything exactly as it had been the day they died. The desks were cluttered with papers, the shelves lined with books and framed photos of her family, all mocking her from the past. But today she saw it differently. Today the penthouse felt like a command center. And Maya at 16 wasn't just a girl caught in the wake of tragedy. She was a leader, a woman on a mission. The baby slept soundly in his crib down the hall, oblivious to the storm raging outside. But she wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for him, for the legacy her parents had left behind, for everything Langston Blake had stolen. Eric walked in quietly, a manila folder in hand. The determined look on his face mirrored hers, but beneath his confidence, she could see the edge of fear. He knew exactly what they were about to do. They had spent countless nights planning, tracing Langston's every move, and now they had the final pieces. The last step was the hardest. "Everything's in place," Eric said, handing her the folder. "We have the leverage. The last of the evidence we need to bring him down." Maya took it without hesitation, flipping through the documents inside. Her hands were steady, her heart cold, as she scanned each page. Bank transfers, business dealings, secret emails between Langston and his partners in crime. The final blow, the one that would destroy him, lay in the last set of documents. A series of communications revealing that Langston had been behind her parents' deaths. Not just the crash, but the entire setup, engineered to look like a tragic accident. He had bribed officials to cover his tracks. And the moment her father's life insurance payout came through, Langston had quickly moved to seize control of the business. This wasn't just about corporate rivalry. It was personal. Langston had taken the one thing Maya couldn't afford to lose, and now she would take it all back. "You're sure this is the way?" Eric asked quietly, his voice laced with caution. "If we go through with this, there's no turning back." Maya looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sure. He needs to pay for everything. And if I have to burn him to the ground to get my parents' company back, so be it." Eric paused, then nodded grimly. "Then let's make sure it's done right." It didn't take long for them to set their plan in motion. Maya knew Langston better than anyone else. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator. A man who thrived on manipulation and deceit. But even predators had weaknesses. Maya had spent the last few weeks carefully picking at his armor, finding cracks in his operations. It wasn't enough to simply expose him. She had to destroy his empire. She had used the information in the folder to her advantage. A cleverly timed leak to the press, showing Langston's connections to the organized crime syndicates, had sparked a media frenzy. Every detail, every name was carefully chosen. Maya wanted to make sure Langston's reputation was shredded beyond repair. It was no longer about the business. It was about ensuring his fall was as public and humiliating as possible. The press picked up on the story quickly. Headlines screamed his name, exposing him as the puppet master behind multiple shady deals, the orchestrator of her parents' untimely deaths. The more the story spread, the more people began to question his legitimacy in the business world. Investors pulled their money. Board members began to distance themselves. Langston was losing control. But that wasn't enough for Maya. Not yet. She and Eric had already set the next phase in motion, ensuring Langston's financial empire would crumble under the weight of his own corruption. Maya had gone to the authorities, high-ranking officials who owed favors to her parents and who could see that Langston's criminal dealings were properly investigated. Langston had thought his connections would protect him, but Maya had anticipated his every move. And then the final nail in his coffin: a secret meeting with Langston's most powerful competitors. Maya had set it all up, using the information from the folder to arrange a high-stakes negotiation where Langston was caught red-handed attempting to undercut his rivals with illegal tactics. The competitors were ready, armed with their own copies of the documents she'd leaked, eager to bring him down. The day Langston Blake was arrested, Maya stood at the window of her penthouse, watching the flashing lights of police cars below. Eric was beside her, his face impassive, but Maya could see the tightness in his jaw. "He's done," Eric said, his voice low. Maya didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained focused on the scene outside, but her thoughts were far away. It was over now. The man who had murdered her parents and stolen everything from her was going to pay for his crimes. He would never see the inside of a courtroom again, not without the weight of the world crashing down on him. Yet, even as the victory settled over her, A strange emptiness filled the space where her rage had once been. It was hard to explain. Her parents were still gone. The life she had once known was still lost. The future she had once imagined, of sitting beside her father in the boardroom, of building the empire with him, was forever out of reach. But then she looked at the baby, still sleeping in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in the peace that only innocence could bring. She had won not just for herself but for him. The future was still hers to shape. And for the first time since the accident, Maya knew exactly who she was. She was her parents' daughter. She was the rightful heir to their legacy, and she would rebuild. Langston Blake might have tried to take everything from her, but he had underestimated the one thing he could never control: Maya's will. The empire that had once belonged to her parents was now hers to reclaim, and this time no one was going to take it from her.